we follow directions. We're fairly consolidated. And as you may pick up, I'm a teacher, I'm not a preacher. So it helps to have people here where I can see them and read your faces and answer questions and things and not have the scattered masses. And if you sit way in the back, my practice of teaching is that's the first person I call on, whoever's sitting furthest in the back. So, welcome. We'll wait one more minute for people to sort of get settled, get our minds ready, and then probably hard for me to force you to open in prayer since you're not Mike in this context. So. Okay, and let me say, I also have a few handouts from yesterday. If you weren't here yesterday, you can come up afterwards and get one of those handouts. And we are just about out now of today's handout, which is a great sign. Okay, let's open with a word of prayer. God, we come to you today in a spirit of humility, with open minds and open hearts, in learning more about your world, especially aspects of your world that we may not allow ourselves to encounter authentically. Give us wisdom and discernment and a sense of your abiding peace and sovereignty. Amen. Okay, first, a brief review from yesterday. So yesterday we went over some background principles on Christian engagement with culture, and we went through Sanctity of Life, and we covered a ton of stuff in a very tight space that was getting warm by the end, and so some of your pulses may have been descending rapidly by the end, and you may not have had your questions answered. So I'm going to give you an opportunity in just a minute to answer any questions that might be lingering from our discussion yesterday. Just a quick review, what I was hoping to do yesterday on the topic of sanctity of life. And well, first let me go over real quickly, refresh on what these fundamental commitments are, the principles that we want to follow in all of these discussions. One, an understanding and commitment to the natural law. Two, an understanding and commitment to human dignity, right? That all human beings are intrinsically valuable, beyond measure, and worthy of love and respect, regardless of their particular abilities or characteristics from conception to natural death. Three, solidarity, the love of neighbor. Four, subsidiarity, that we are more than the individual and the state, that the associations that we are part of are an absolutely key part of our social order, and they should be respected and honored as well. Five, we are fallen. It's never going to be perfect. We can't idealize or romanticize or glamorize. We are fallen creatures, but we still need to work for what Reinhold Niebuhr would call a tolerable justice in this world. And then sixth, be not afraid. Christian engagement with culture should not be fear-driven. Fear is not a Christian virtue. And then what I was trying to do on the subject of abortion and sanctity of life is, one, just to give you a little bit of introduction to why we need to be careful with just these categorical denunciations of judges as sort of these evil activist judges. There are some judges who I think have gotten things wrong, but the nature of judging is inescapably intertwined with interpretation, as we saw with that example of something simple like no vehicles in the park, right? You have to put a read on that beyond just what the text says, and it doesn't mean that you've departed from your judicial role. It's inherent in the judicial role. So we have to be specific in our criticisms of judges in the American legal system, which I say without any hesitation is the best legal system in the world. On sanctity of life, I wanted you to see that cases that are in traditional Christians' view infamous, such as Roe versus Wade, do not drop out of the sky fully formed and saying, oh, everything was great and now we don't like it. these evolve over many decades, and each case decision is an incremental and understandable step from the one that came before. So you go from cases almost 100 years ago affirming the right of a parent to direct the upbringing of a child, which is not in the Constitution, to today the right nationwide for same-sex marriage, which is not in the Constitution, but it's that same stream of reasoning. When it comes to abortion in particularly, which we focused in on, what I wanted you to see is that it's not that the Peter Singer ethic, that we only value the life that has certain characteristics that newborns or pre-born life doesn't have. It's not that that ethic won over the human dignity ethic. It's both of those views were put to the sidelines by our focus in American law on individual autonomy, the right of individuals to make decisions for themselves and direct the course of their own lives. Something that's not bad in itself, but traditional Christians would say there need to be limits on that right of individual autonomy. And so this overarching theme that Phil and I have this week of how we engage culture, how we can deepen our understanding of those with whom we disagree. The reason I fit this into that theme is it doesn't serve us well for Christians who are trying to speak up for the sanctity of life in our culture. It doesn't serve us well to dismiss those with whom we disagree as either, against babies or wanting to get rid of old people or just, evil incarnate. They are swimming in the cultural river of individual autonomy. If you're opposing that, you're swimming upstream. Okay? And that doesn't mean you change your views or you stop swimming upstream. It means that maybe there's a little bit more empathy for those who disagree with us. They're the ones going along with the current. And it's too simplistic to say, well, it's just, they just don't care about life. Well, there's some in that category, but not many. Really, it's that cultural stream about the individual gets to decide. It's that Supreme Court passage that was on the first slide, that the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence and the meaning of life. That's what it is. That's the cultural river. It's not so much anti-life, it's I decide what life is. Okay? So that was the purpose of yesterday. There were some good questions I got afterwards, but let me open it up. I know this is a big room, it's hard to ask questions, but I'll restate your question.
I have a question. Is there any law progression right now for the validity of individual autonomy for the unborn child?
Is there any progression in law for the
validity of individual autonomy for the unborn child?
Excellent. Okay. Is there any progression in law for the validity of the individual autonomy of the unborn child? Great question. Very simple answer, no. So there is a debate. There is a debate among pro-life whether the 14th Amendment, which protects the which gives persons equal protection under the law, should be interpreted to include unborn persons. That's really a debate within the pro-life community. It's not a wider debate. So there's not. There is an interesting, in Europe, which I think has tended to have more sensible debates about abortion, where the debate has focused a lot on what's the point of viability for the unborn life. And the point of regulation should track the point of viability. That is, when can the baby survive outside the mom? And on both sides of the political spectrum, in many countries in Europe, they'll say, well, technology has changed, viability has moved up, so we maybe should change abortion laws. I don't know how much traction that will get in America, given our culture right now, and the fact I think folks who support the right to abortion are leery about the incredible strides technology is making. And viability could move up dramatically And so I don't see that happening. But no, there's no focus on individual autonomy for the unborn child. Yes.
How then do you reconcile when a pregnant woman is still, say, in a car accident? And
Yep.
then the driver of the other car can be charged with a double murder. If that is not
Good.
a life, how can they be charged with murder?
Great question. So the question is, in many of our criminal laws, we do recognize the life of the unborn child when it comes to vehicular manslaughter or other cases. I teach tort law, so that's your right to be compensated for wrongs. You certainly can be compensated for the wrong suffered to your unborn child. There are torts like wrongful birth, etc. There are inconsistencies in our law. Right? I think someone who tries to reconcile this would say it's really not focused on the freestanding independent status of the unborn child, but the loss or the harm to the person carrying that unborn child. I think that's a little too trite. I think it's inconsistent. Any other questions before we keep going? Yep.
I asked you afterwards the other day, or yesterday, is there anything that we as Christians can be doing in the public arena to advance what we expect without, basically calling them demons, the opponents?
Right. Are there things that Christians can do in the public square short of calling our opponents demons? Simple answer, yes. No, it's a good question, and this is a question that's answered by so many people sitting in this room and the lives you lead and the ministries you have. I mean, the public square is answered by what churches are doing in communities, what individuals are doing. I mean, met yesterday somebody who had so many foster kids coming to their home, so many ministries for young unwed pregnant women. That's what speaks the loudest by far, right? I'm a lawyer, but I don't ever mistake me of saying that your most important engagement as a Christian is in the political or legal sphere. It is not. It is in the daily lives you lead in your community. That said, at some point, there is cause to be engaged in the political and legal spheres, and there I think this is where it gets complicated. Because for some folks who speak on behalf of the pro-life side, compromise is the real-world progression toward a tolerable justice, like Reinhold Niebuhr would call it. For others, compromise is giving away the entire principled stand. So, for example, how do you speak if there's abortion legislation proposed? What do you do with exceptions for rape and incest? There are many pro-life voices who would say, yeah, if we can get abortion legislation that has an exception for rape and incest, absolutely, absolutely, no question about it. That's so much better than the current regime, and it's also a concession to the fallen world that we're in. Others would say, okay, once we say that exceptions for rape and incest are permissible, it's no longer about defending innocent human life, period. It's defending innocent human life, except, and then that exception can get expanded when there's economic distress or when there's mental health concerns or whatever the case might be. And so that's an example where I don't have the answers. That's just where Christians have to work through this. But great question. Time for one more. Yes? Yep. Oh, good. So the question is in areas like criminal law and tort law, where we have some, not necessarily protections for unborn life, but we have punishments for the taking of unborn life, is that a concession to our recognition of when life begins? Is that accurate? Yes, but I'm not sure proponents would be willing to go very far, because they're on very treacherous ground. But I do think it underscores one thing I was trying to point out yesterday is I don't think the real dispute about abortion is when life begins. I don't think that's the dispute. The dispute is how can we honor the autonomy of women in their choices about procreation and reproduction. And there have been, as I said, many instances in history where we have not been, as a society, supportive and affirming and encouraging for women in those choices, and this is an extension of that. That's the debate. It's not about when life begins, because I think from a scientific standpoint, it's pretty clear when life begins. Okay, let me do, before we get into the topic for today, I want to give you, a couple other people brought up this Buck versus Bell case that we talked about yesterday, and I should have spent a little more time on it because the comments and questions are about, well, how did we get there? That seems like such an outrageous case. Okay, so if you weren't here yesterday, Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was a young woman who's had foster parents, and I said yesterday it was her foster brother. It was the nephew, I believe, who raped her. She was committed to a mental institution by her foster parents. Even though she had had passing grades in school up to then, she was deemed to be mentally unfit. She had a baby, and I had said yesterday that the baby was deemed mentally unfit at 1 year old. The baby was deemed mentally unfit at 6 months old. Okay? So that became the basis for the state of Virginia to say, we have to stop these mental, what they would say, imbeciles from reproducing. We are forcibly sterilizing against her will. The U.S. Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, famously, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And this law is fine. It does not violate the Constitution. We validate this. How did we get here? All right, so this will be a little mini law school course. Oliver Wendell Holmes says, if the state can call upon the best citizens for their lives, it would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. Now, remember we talked about yesterday, judges in the United States, we have a common law system, which means judges have to justify their rulings based on what's been ruled by previous courts. Our law is a gradual unfolding over time. The rule of law means we don't just say, we like this, we don't like this, we like this, we don't like this, we like this person, we don't like this person. We say, no, we have fixed principles, and the work comes in applying them to new sets of facts. So, Oliver Wendell Holmes is doing this, is one of our most famous judges. So he cites past cases where the court has upheld the military draft and required immunizations. So he said, if we as a nation allow a military draft and required immunizations, this required sterilization of Carrie Buck is fine. Okay? Now, we're going to start thinking like lawyers. If you agree with that analogy, right? Required immunizations, military draft, required sterilization, then they're all fine, and Oliver Wendell Holmes is right. If you disagree, you have to show why he's wrong in analogizing the draft immunizations to sterilization. So how would you do it? What's the difference? What? There might be several different. What would you say? Huh?
Immunization is preventing the spread of disease.
Okay, so immunizations are preventing the spread of disease, and sterilization is preventing the spread of incompetence. Same? Okay, how do you define them? So one of these is the nature of the threat. How concrete, how verifiable, how scientifically valid is the threat? Right? Military draft, you have hostile nations attacking the United States. Immunizations, you have verifiable diseases that are communicable by contact and that can be widespread in public. this kind of eugenics stuff of 3 generations, like we thought that criminality would just be inherited across generations, and what they call feeble-mindedness, where's the line here? How do you define this threat? So the threat is much more amorphous and vague and a little bit hokey, okay? So that's one way you push back on Oliver Wendell Holmes said, you are equating threats that are totally different in their nature and how we verify them. What else? Now, just so you know, in law school, I have a big seating chart with everybody's names and faces, and I just start calling them. I hope it does not come to that. Yes?
Not everyone with mental illness would necessarily give birth to somebody else with mental illness.
Good, right? So the causal connection is certainly in question, right? Are you going to solve anything, and are you being over-inclusive in terms of assuming a causal connection? What else?
How consistently are these regulations or laws applied?
Excellent. How consistently are these laws applied? Military draft, if you fit into the category, you're in. Now, there's always questions about who gets out and who uses connections, and to the extent that happens, that's a little, but theoretically, if you fit the classifications for who is fit to serve in the military, you're in. It applies to everybody. Immunizations, it applies to everybody. Forced sterilization, Carrie Buck, yeah, you were institutionalized, we're going to sterilize you. It applies to who you choose, who happens to be in your institution and who the warden happens to pick, okay? So the nature of the threat is different. The allocation of the burden is different, okay? And if we're concerned about justice, we can say that to Oliver Wendell Holmes said, you pick Carrie Buck out of a crowd, out of hundreds of thousands or even millions of folks who we would probably venture to say have a similar IQ. We're very concerned about the invocation of power in unfair ways against particular citizens. That's not the case nearly as much with immunizations or the military draft. Okay, there's one other key distinction.
Well, you can't really confirm that the incompetence is hereditary.
Good. Yeah. What's the science behind the science is much more solid for the immunizations, and for the military, I mean, it doesn't take science. You know how war works, and it takes a certain level of manpower to fuel the machine. Okay. Yes.
There would have to be a criteria.
Okay. A list of criteria. Good. We want it to be sound and equitable. What about what is the intent of the government in drafting soldiers for war? What is the intent of the government in particular as it pertains to the well-being of an individual soldier? What is the government wanting to do?
Protection. Well, the best possible candidate.
Right. Best possible candidates who are trained to protect themselves and function on the battlefield that vindicates the national interest and still minimizes harm to them, right? We give them a helmet, we give them a rifle, we give them all the training we can. What's the intent of the government in requiring kids to be immunized? Protect them. Right. What's the intent of the government in sterilizing Carrie Buck? Protect everybody else, and without question, harming Carrie Buck. You're taking away her ability to reproduce. So, for the military draft, the government is not trying to harm anybody. You're not drafting, it would be different if we were drafting suicide bombers, right? Where we say, we are sacrificing you as the fodder for war and just throwing you out there to die intentionally. Or with immunizations, we have to, somehow this immunization works where we have to sacrifice your life so that you can inoculate others. That's not how it works. But for sterilization, we're saying, you will give up your right to bring children into this world so that we don't have to foot the tax bill that we perceive to flow from the imbeciles that will otherwise emerge. okay? Totally different. This is intentional government harm to the individual who is being selected for sterilization. Okay? So I just want you to see, you read this case, and you say, well, it's Oliver Wendell Holmes. How in the world can I argue with that? Yeah, he's a really smart judge. Of course you can argue with him, and you do it on the terms of legal reasoning, where you say, one of these things is not like the other. You just try to very smoothly slip in, oh, immunizations, military draft, sterilization, all the same. It's not all the same, right? It's not all the same because the nature of the threat is different, the allocation of the burden is different, and the intention of the government as it pertains to the well-being of the individual affected is totally different. You see that? You're all thinking like lawyers now. If you'd like to attend law school in the fall, I have some brochures back here. We can talk. Okay? So that's just a quick introduction to legal reasoning, judicial reasoning, and its key. This is how our legal system works. All these cases you hear about in the news, this is what they're doing, is saying, this case is like this past case. The other side is saying, no, it's not like that past case, it's like this past case. That's what lawyers do. Okay. Yeah.
What about culture? Does culture allow that sort of culture today would allow that? Is there a role
Good.
for culture as well?
Yep, great point, Brian. What's the role of culture in all this? And I've said this before, I will say it again. Culture is always prior to law, right? Law emerges from culture. It's not exactly the same, because there are some principles that can help shape culture, not just be shaped by culture, but culture is always prior to law. So any great legal development that we see in the law, we can also have a conversation about the cultural development. So today we'll talk about, the move from Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education. Huge cultural changes from the 1800s to 1954 in terms of that. So yeah, it's a great point. Culture always comes first. Okay, we're going to talk about race now. So let me get into this a little bit with sort of my own personal journey in this. Yesterday I gave you just a ton of information. I'm going to give you a lot of information, but I also want to just open up our perspective a little bit. So when I was a practicing attorney at a law firm in Chicago, one of the things I did for my pro bono service was I would give seminars on housing rights. Now, if you are from Chicago or know Chicago, you remember back in the early, mid, late 90s, they were tearing down a lot of the high-rise public housing projects, giving the residents of those housing projects Section 8 vouchers to go into the suburbs and find housing. So one of the housing rights seminars I did, I went down to, it might have been the Robert Taylor Homes, it was one of the housing projects, and walked into a room filled with lifetime residents of these housing projects who were about to have their towers demolished and handed a Section 8 voucher to go find housing in the suburbs. And I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, the overwhelmingly white, at that time anyway, suburbs of Chicago. And I walked into this room thinking, they are going to treat me like a conquering hero. They're going to be so ecstatic and happy they get to escape these downtrodden, dilapidated housing projects and go live where I grew up. They're going to be so happy. It's going to be like a party. And as you probably could guess, it was not like a party. There was tremendous fear in that room. I was not effective at engaging with them because my own bias that had been shaped by my upbringing didn't have space to realize, you know what, my suburbs have not always been real friendly to African Americans looking for housing. And these housing projects, which I wouldn't want to live in, they also had been the only community that many of these people had ever known. And so I walked in thinking, hey, come to my neighborhood. This will be great. That helped teach me that my story is not the story. So how do I enter into other people's stories? So What else has shaped me in this area? Well, one way that many of us grow is as parents, and our children can be an impetus for our growth. And so I'll give you one example with one of my daughters, Lila, who's here. So she has pushed me to grow in new ways. This was a couple of years ago when Lila was a 7th grader, and in Minneapolis where we live, this is right after one of the police-involved shootings had happened, and Black Lives Matter in Minneapolis had really, gotten a lot of energy, and Lila, I knew, had been interested in following some of these issues. And one day, I'm in Texas at a conference, and I'm about to go and present a paper at this conference. I'm really about to walk up on the platform and present this paper, and I get a call on my cell phone, and it's Lila. And I'm like, what is she calling me for? And she says, hey Dad, is it okay if I participate in a walkout from school? I'm like, what? She said, yeah, there's a Black Lives Matter protest, and so we're going to walk out of school just to show support for the protest. And so, of course, my first question is, where's your mom? and Mom was in the weekly mom's prayer group, so it shut off her cell phone, so this was on me, which I didn't like that. But I asked Lila some questions about why she wanted to do this, what she hoped to accomplish by this, what her support meant, and she had good answers. And so, in this case, my main objective is not to make sure my kids always agree with me, but to make sure that they have a coherent articulation of why they're taking action. And so I said, sure, you can participate. About a half hour later, I get a call from the assistant principal of the school. And she says, well, Mr. Vischer, I just wanted you to know that Lila may be subject to some school discipline. She walked out without parental supervision or adult supervision. And I said, okay, yeah, no, I know she was going to do that. I know, it's fine. She'll, whatever the consequences are, she'll gladly take. She knows there could have been consequences. And she said, well, I just have to point out that, we offered them space in the school cafeteria to have a protest in support of Black Lives Matter, but that was deemed insufficient. They needed to walk out of school. I said, oh, okay, well, and this is a very large Minneapolis public school, middle school, I don't know, 800, 900 kids, 1,000. And I said, so, all together, how many students walked out today in protest? All of them. 7. I said, oh, okay, well, they're taking a leadership role. I appreciate that. So, one of the, and I got her permission to talk about this, so I'm not telling tales out of school. One of the struggles for Lila has been some of the social justice issues she sees in the world, not seeing them addressed as directly in our church. And so figuring out how you come alongside your child as they're trying to walk this journey. At the same time, all this is blowing up in Minneapolis. And I saw on social media, some of you might remember this from the news, after the shooting of Jamar Clark in Minneapolis, Black Lives Matter protesters formed an encampment on the street outside the police station in North Minneapolis, and they stayed there for a number of weeks. And I saw on social media that they were going to have a worship service that Sunday morning. And whether it was my own thinking or God's word, whatever it was, I just had this sense of, I think I need to go to the worship service live. Now, for those of you who know me, I am not one who rushes to a protest site. If I am going to participate in a protest, it's probably going to be holding a sign that says, hey everybody, it's more complicated than you think. But we went to the encampment on the Sunday morning, and it was beautiful. It was a worship service. And they were praying, and they were singing hymns, and they were reading scriptures about justice and standing up for the oppressed, and it was beautiful. And for me, it was not necessarily about agreeing with this particular tactic or that. It was about just understanding. Last perspective I'll offer, and then we'll get into this full speed ahead. My last perspective is in my professional life. So I'm the dean of a law school at St. Thomas in Minneapolis, and so I'm sort of in charge of the faculty. Now, people who know academic settings know in charge is kind of in quotes there. But one of our faculty members, when all this was happening, was the head of the local NAACP and was very active in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's her. Her name's Nikema Levy-Pounds, and she's also a very strong Christian. And that photo of Nikema is from an evening after one of these shootings where she led a large group on a cold, rainy night out onto I-94 in the middle of Minneapolis and shut down the interstate. And when I saw that news, my initial reaction, like many of yours might have been, was, what a dumb thing to do. How is that going to inspire those with the wisdom and justice of your cause? You're inconveniencing people. Maybe there's somebody who's trying to get to work. Maybe there's an ambulance trying to get through. Why in the world would you shut down the interstate? And then since I'm the dean, I started getting calls from members of the public and alumni and other folks, asking me why I don't fire this person, how we can tolerate this, all this. And many of the calls were totally reasonable, and I understand, and yes, I understand you disagree with these tactics, and yes, that caused some harm, etc. There was another subset of the calls that there was such a deep level of rage, sort of a, who do these people think they are, that really took me aback. And that caused me to think anew about this, and so how I've tried to approach this. Again, this whole week, it's not about agreement. It is not about agreement, it's about understanding. So, as I approach this, how desperate would I have to feel to walk out onto the middle of an interstate on a cold and rainy night and kneel there in prayer to stop traffic? How desperate would I have to feel? And so what I want to do with our time is, this is nearly impossible to do, but sort of let go of as many presuppositions as you can, avoid the yes but, and just open our minds to a perspective that we may not share. And that is the perspective of African Americans in the United States. I'm going to give you a very cursory tour through some of the low points that's only trying to get us to the understanding. And again, it's a very specific point. Can we understand what would motivate good people to walk into the interstate on a cold and rainy night? Okay? So let's get started. Let's go back to 1675. Some of you might have studied this in school long ago, called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a planter who wanted to seize Native American lands that had been rejected by other Virginia planters. He wanted to seize, his plan was rejected by other Virginia planters, the elite planters. Bacon took revenge by building an alliance of slaves and indentured servants and poor whites, sort of an economic, hopeful revolution to overturn the elite. It didn't work, but the white elites in Virginia recognized that they were in trouble if slaves and poor whites banded together. And so they took some of the first major steps to make the hierarchy less economic and more racial. Or, put differently, to create a racial hierarchy in service of economic hierarchy. Okay? So some simple things. They started importing more slaves from Africa than from the West Indies, because from Africa they couldn't speak English, there was no cultural familiarity, there was less affinity, common background with the white poor. They gave poor whites more access to Native American lands, gave them something so they would be happy. They were recruited for police and slave patrols, so the poor whites had someone they could enforce the law against that they could look down on. They put in rules so slave labor couldn't compete with free labor on in different jobs, right? And it didn't all start with Bacon's Rebellion, I'm not suggesting that. But this was one major move where the racial hierarchy came to the fore, okay? Bacon's Rebellion. We're going to fast forward almost 200 years. Dred Scott versus Sanford. And again, all these cases, all these histories I'm talking about, try to think about your understanding of your society if you're viewing these cases through the eyes of an African-American student, a law student, right? A young person growing up. So Dred Scott, you may have heard of the case, Dred Scott was a slave taken by his owner from Missouri, which was a slave state, to live in Illinois, which was a free state. He was married, he lived there for several years, his owner died, they returned to Missouri because they wanted to live there, and he wanted to be free. Right? He'd been free for years. He was in Illinois free state, went back to Missouri. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's not possible. So this is the U.S. Supreme Court. Remember when we talked about don't romanticize the good old days? Okay, this is the U.S. Supreme Court. Even if blacks could be citizens of a state, they are not citizens of the United States. And they have no standing to sue in federal court. So the U.S. Supreme Court says, we shouldn't have even had to rule on whether you could be free or not, because you shouldn't even be in court, because you're not even a citizen, because you're black. Blacks were not among the we the people by whom and for whom the United States was founded. So Dred Scott was never free because Congress had no power to forbid slavery in the territories. And this gets into history, but basically the Missouri Compromise was invalid. But what I want you to see is, you read this case, we talk about the glory of the American experiment, our shared history. And you read Dred Scott and you can say, oh, well, I guess that shared history doesn't extend to everybody. Right? This is our highest court interpreting the Constitution, actually saying, you are not among we the people. Okay, so now if you might know Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves during the Civil War. What happened after the Emancipation Proclamation? What happened after the Civil War? Sometimes when we think about history, we say, man, slavery was horrible. Thank goodness Lincoln came along, ended it, all was good. We had some Jim Crow stuff coming later, but for the most part, all was good. The Emancipation Proclamation did the trick. Okay, 9 states after the Emancipation Proclamation enacted vagrancy laws, making it a crime not to be working. They were applied selectively to blacks. Sometimes verbatim in the statute it would say, all free Negroes must have proof of a job. Okay? You just were released as slaves. Okay? You are now committing a crime if you don't have a job. 8 of those 9 states then permitted prisoners to be hired out to plantation owners with little or no pay going to prisoners themselves. Right? You're our prisoner now because you don't have a job. The plantation owners that used to enslave you can hire you now, and they're basically going to be paying rent to the state. Because you're our property, essentially. There are additional laws passed prohibiting mischief and insulting gestures that created huge markets for convict leasing. They also imposed requirements that prisoners work off their court fines before their release. Okay? In some cases, the work conditions were worse than slavery because the person leasing another human being on the short term had less economic incentive to care for them than the person who owned them in the long term. And I'm not saying that the conditions for slavery good by any means. But just note that these became the short-term leasing of criminals as a replacement for the ownership. And it was still almost always limited to blacks. It was explicit based on the color of your skin. Okay? That's after the Civil War. Okay, fast forward into the early 20th century. Every state in the South mandated racial segregation in law, which supported a social ostracism that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restaurants, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, cemeteries. It was a completely segregated society. And politicians would compete with each other to see who could be most pro-segregation and most stringent. So now you go back and read it, so how silly this is, the specificity of some of the laws, like laws prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. Real laws. This was the culture. Segregation, total segregation forever. Okay, Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, among these many segregation laws in Louisiana, if you've been to New Orleans and ridden the streetcars in New Orleans, not surprisingly, those were segregated. So you had to be in either the streetcar car for colored or for whites. This is Homer Plessy. So here's the first question. This is a little bit of an aside on lawyers and how this works. He looks pretty white. He was arrested for riding in the white car. In reality, he was 1/8 black. But that still counted as black under the laws. Even if you couldn't discern it, he was still treated as black. Now, one question you might ask, well, how in the world did he get arrested then? Right? Why would he get arrested if he looked white? Anybody have any guesses why that would? Okay.
Did he tell them that he was black while he was sitting down in the white section?
Say it a little louder.
Didn't he say that he was that he was black as he was sitting down in the white section?
Good. Yes. Why would he tell them that he was black?
Because it was impossible for
Why would he want them to know he was black? Social justice. Right. This is what you call a test case. Okay. So, little side. Most of the landmark Supreme Court cases that harken change in constitutional law, the plaintiffs involved in those cases, it's not an accident. Right? So, you see this all the time. So, for example, in the Obergefell case, the same-sex marriage case that we'll talk more about on Thursday, it's not an accident that the lead plaintiffs were two women who had been in a committed relationship for something like 50 years. Right? Those are the most sympathetic plaintiffs you could have. You're not going to have as plaintiffs, two men who met last night at the nightclub. Right? Those are not sympathetic plaintiffs for same-sex marriage. Here, it was an upstanding member of society who looked white, who walked into the streetcar and said, guess what? I'm black. He got arrested. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court because they said, okay, we're going to finally get rid of these crazy laws. These are unjust. They clearly violate the equal protection that's guaranteed under the Constitution. U.S. Supreme Court says, a law that requires separate rail cars is reasonable because 4 basic points. Law reflects our customs and traditions. Okay? Now, I hope you can see the problem in that reasoning. It's very hard to speak prophetically against injustice if law just reflects what we're already doing. Okay? The game is up. If we're going to enforce customs and traditions, well, they're not going to be changing. Okay? Law preserves peace and good order. If these, African Americans are going to be provoking things like this, like sitting in the streetcar of their choosing, they're going to disrupt the peace. Not to mention that they're not really causing any violence or disruption. It's the reaction to that that's causing the potential violence and disruption. Law cannot overcome social prejudices. We're powerless here. We're just simple judges, and the law just has to reflect that. Maybe they would cite Genesis 3, right? And Niebuhr would respond, yes, Genesis 3, but don't forget the tolerable justice. Right? We still have to work. And then finally, separate does not mean inferior. Now, yes, that is true. And we see that. I mean, there's lots of instances of separation, and, you know, we go to all-girls private school, or, you know, separate restrooms, or whatever. Yes, there are instances where separate can not mean inferior. In our particular history of race, separate always means inferior. Right? You cannot look back to a particular case, whether it's you compare the conditions of the motel entrance for blacks versus those for whites, or the restaurants, or the schools, or everything. It always. So this was, they were making a theoretical point without any attention to the reality on the ground. Okay, fast forward, Brown versus Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson finally. Now, the opinion is of relatively little interest. In fact, the opinion is kind of flimsy, and it's not very impressive. One way to interpret Brown versus Board of Education is not so much that the American legal system had finally realized the error of its ways when it comes to race, but more, the American political culture had realized what a tremendous liability our treatment of blacks was in a geopolitical sense. What was going on in the world in 1954 that we cared about? Well, Korean War, the Cold War, okay? So one interpretation of Brown, and I don't want people to be cynical, I just want you to, you know, have your eyes open to this. One thing that had changed in the culture is the Cold War. And we were all, the U.S. and Soviet Union were competing in the world to get the third world on their side. And the Soviet Union was hammering us, saying, oh, you're gonna choose sides with the United States? You see how they treat their blacks? Right? That's where you're gonna hitch your wagon, is to that completely segregated society. There are also things that happen in culture, such as Jackie Robinson, you know, the rise of jazz. I mean, lots of things that brought more cultural awareness of this. This, I think, is an example where culture begat law. But Brown said, no, segregation does communicate inferiority. That's a problem, and it can't stand under our Constitution. Okay, so you're thinking, all right, well, we finally got rid of slavery. We finally got rid of those crazy, you know, laws post-Civil War. Now we finally got rid of segregation. We finally, in 1954, can be a post-racial society. Thank goodness. Okay, what happened after Brown? 1956, the Southern Manifesto pledging to maintain Jim Crow by all means was signed by 101 of 128 members of Congress from the South. 5 states passed nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws after Brown versus Board. Private whites-only, what were called segregation academies, arose across South. The response was, well, you can integrate the public schools, you can't integrate the private schools. Those are beyond your jurisdiction, and so we're going to retreat to the private schools. Sadly, many of them were at least styled as Christian academies for the white kids in the South. The Voting Rights Act, here's a positive. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, and you can, the statistics here are astounding. Just one example. So theoretically, blacks had the right to vote, but through a variety of mechanisms, they were denied the right to vote. Whether it was having to selectively pay a tax at the voting booth, having to do a literacy test that would change randomly and only be applied to certain people, whatever. So in Mississippi, blacks registered to vote went from 6% to 66% in 5 years. That is a successful piece of legislation. Right? There were also, as you know, in the 60s, widespread civil rights protests. And we know the history of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Birmingham bus boycott and all of those. That also provoked a backlash. Now, I'm just going to warn you, I'm going to be bipartisan in my criticism for a little bit here because neither party has a great record on this. But John Ehrlichman, who you might know from Watergate and was one of the key architects of Nixon's campaign strategy, he actually said in 1968, we're going to go after the racists. And that was part of that was the law and order rhetoric that was directly in response to civil rights protests. So in 1968, a Gallup poll, 81% agreed that the law and order has broken down in this country. The majority of those 81% blamed communists and Negroes who start riots. Okay? This was a new era in race relations, where you see the rhetoric became, we have made enough progress, and now things are getting out of control, and we need to impose more control. Right? Okay, so stay with me here. There's different aspects we need to address. One is economic inequality. That is scandalous today on racial lines. Okay, home ownership. The Federal Housing Authority, their underwriting manual in the 1930s said, so this is federal government. Federal government. Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. Federal government, 1930s. That's long after Plessy versus Ferguson. 1934, the Federal Housing Administration created a risk rating system to determine which neighborhoods were safe investment for federally backed mortgages. Black neighborhoods were intrinsically risky. This is what you call redlining, right? You mark out the high-risk neighborhoods, and that means the federal backing is not going to be available for housing in those neighborhoods. The problem is those neighborhoods translated into racial lines. Let me give you an example. I'm from Minneapolis, and we tend to think of Minneapolis as this, uber progressive bastion of Scandinavian insight and good sense, and of course everybody is equal, etc. 1948, 40% of new housing developments in Minneapolis had covenants prohibiting purchase by African Americans. That is not that long ago. 40% of new housing developments in 1948 in Minneapolis. Our churches bought property, and when they were doing all the background deed work, they found the church, every property around the church had been subject to a racially restrictive covenant. In our very own neighborhood. Okay? Until 1950, the Realtors Code of Ethics prohibited selling a house in a white neighborhood to non-whites. That's the National Realtors Code of Ethics. If you did something like that, you were behaving unethically. Until 1950. And then it changed to where you shouldn't be selling in a way that's going to detract from the value of the neighborhood, which many people read as kind of code for keep doing what you've been doing. Okay, so the picture up there shows the racial segregation in different metro communities. The Federal Housing Authority, back in the same time period, 1940s and 50s, when there was all this expansion in urban areas, explicitly recommended highways as a way to separate blacks from white neighborhoods. Right? You sometimes, when you're driving through a big city, and you wonder, well, why is the highway here and not here? Sometimes it's not just happenstance. The FHA also funded huge white-only suburban housing developments, leaving blacks in inner cities. It wasn't, we've all, I think, heard about white flight. Yes, some of that was just an organic decision by whites to leave neighborhoods that they sensed were becoming too diverse. But some of it was pursuant to policies that the government had. So the problem is blacks couldn't live in white neighborhoods because there were actual restrictive covenants. And they couldn't get loans for black neighborhoods. Right? You're not allowed to live in the white neighborhoods, And the black neighborhood's too risky for the federal government to back up the mortgages, so mortgage providers aren't going to lend to you in the black neighborhood. That's not a sound investment. A little between a rock and a hard place. Home ownership is absolutely key to intergenerational wealth. So today, African American income is an average 60% of average white income. But African American household wealth is less than 10% of white household wealth. That's a massive difference.
Per capita or overall?
This is household, average household. Yep. So, on average, nationwide, 2/3 of our household wealth is in our home equity. If you miss out on home equity, especially in the post-World War II years of the housing boom, you've missed out on the wealth that allows you to pay for your kids' college, that allows you to fund your retirement, that allows you to, pass money along to the next generation. That's huge. That's just one snapshot on housing and how our policies that were rooted in a systemically unjust past still are seen today. Okay. Now we'll get a little, I don't know if this will be controversial or not, but we're going to talk about the war on drugs. So the criminal justice system is an area that Christians have to know something about. Okay? Let's start with John.
Can I go back to the housing stuff?
Yep.
There's a book that's on my list to read,
Yep.
Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.
I have not heard of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, but I will check it out. So the war on drugs, which really launched in 1982. But you got to go back a little farther. Is everybody still okay? Are we losing anyone? Oh, okay. We're just going to keep plowing right through. And again, I'm not looking for agreement. We're looking for understanding. I want you to see everything through the lens of how could I get to the point where I walk onto Interstate 94 on a dark and rainy night. That's the very simple purpose. Okay. 1970s, most blacks had no college and had attended segregated schools. Right? North and south. In the 1970s especially, new factories were moving to the suburbs. In the urban areas, and there are lots of statistics on this, the overwhelming majority of inner city blacks did not have access to a car. They did not follow the jobs to the suburbs. Okay? So in 1970, 70% of blacks had blue-collar jobs. By 1987, 28% did. So you've got some economic vulnerability in our inner cities. Blacks had the great migration of moving from the south to northern inner cities for jobs, for factory jobs. And then those factory jobs went away. And again, I will be bipartisan in this if you give me a minute. So under President Reagan and then President George H.W. Bush, the war on drugs really ramped up. But I want you to see the nature of the funding. The war on drugs. From 1981 to 1991, Department of Defense funding for the war on drugs went from $33 million to $1 billion. The Drug Enforcement Agency went from $86 million to $1 billion. National Institute on Drug Abuse dropped from 81 to 84, $274 million to $57 million. Department of Education, anti-drug efforts, $14 million to $3 million. So there's some priorities reflected. I'm not criticizing, I'm just putting these out there, that these were deliberate decisions made. Okay, and we're going to get a little technical here, but bear with me. So in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act introduced mandatory minimum sentences. It used to be that judges had pretty broad discretion to sentence someone based on what they thought was just under the circumstances. We became concerned that judges were being too lenient or being partial to one person and not another, so we said we're going to have mandatory minimum sentence, and for drugs, because we're in a war on drugs, we are going to throw the book at it. So one thing they did, They had much harsher sentences for distribution of crack cocaine than powder cocaine. Crack was more associated with blacks than whites. That's been rectified, but it took about 30 years to rectify it. Evictions from public housing for any tenant who permits drug-related criminal activity to occur on or near premises. That's big, right? And that can sweep in folks who aren't directly involved, but know about it and refuse to kick out their son or brother or whoever, right? Evicted from public housing. Eliminated government benefits, including student loans for any drug crime. In 1988, and this is very technical, but it's important. 1988, there was a 5-year prison sentence minimum for possessing any amount of cocaine base, even if there was no intent to distribute it. Even if you just had this for your own use or there was no evidence that you were going to sell it to other people, a 5-year minimum that previously had been a 1-year maximum for any amount of any drug without evidence of intent to distribute. Right? You see the big, huge difference? 1-year maximum, unless there's evidence that you intended to distribute it. Now it's 5-year minimum. Okay? Do we start feeling the prisons getting a little bit more swelled in population? Okay, Clinton presidency. Now, President Clinton was half-jokingly often referred to as our nation's first black president. You might have heard, right? Because he was so widely supported by the black community, and his messages got so much traction within the black community. He is as responsible for the over-incarceration crisis as any other president in reality. So, let me give you some examples. So, funding for public housing was cut by $17 billion during the Clinton presidency. Funding for prisons increased by $19 billion, 171% during the time of the Clinton presidency. Americans in prison for drug crimes, 1980, 41,000. Today, over 500,000, which is more than the entire prison population in 1980. Most arrests are for possession, not for selling. The statistics I have from 2005, 80% was for possession, 20% was for selling. Okay? Most arrests are for marijuana. In the 1990s, the huge explosion of drug arrests, 80% of that growth was for marijuana, which, I mean, there's an ongoing debate about whether marijuana should be legal or not. We're not getting into that. But just note that there are thousands and thousands of people serving long prison sentences for possession of marijuana. Okay, war on drugs continued. The New Haven, Connecticut police chief, he gave an interview where he said, you know, I was offered tanks, bazookas, anything I wanted, right? This is part of the war on drugs. The federal government is what we call the militarization of the local police. If you're really going to battle the war on drugs, you've got to have the equipment you need. So between 1997 and 1999, right, 2-year period, the Pentagon handled 3.4 million orders for equipment from 11,000 police agencies in the U.S. 253 aircraft, including Black Hawk and Huey helicopters, almost 8,000 M16s, 181 grenade launchers, more than 8,000 bulletproof helmets, 1,000 night vision goggles. Okay, so again, and this is not a criticism of the police, this is an observation about incentives created when the federal government decides to make all of this hardware available to local police departments. And the military equipment is, for the most part, not seen on the streets of my neighborhood in South Minneapolis, right? So, whose worldview is it shaping? You know, I grew up with a picture of Officer Friendly, who really was my friend, and just walking into the school, and when your exposure is this military side, what does that do to the view? Let me give you Minneapolis, again, the uber progressive, liberal, enlightened city. No knock entry. So when the SWAT team comes in, and almost always on drug cases, comes in and smashes through the door and and creates some havoc in trying to get the surprise on them. 1986, they did that 35 times. 1996, they did it more than 700 times. How does that change a neighborhood's understanding of the police. War on drugs continued a little bit about the financial incentives. Again, as part of the war on drugs, federal grants to local police were tied to the number of drug arrests. Civil forfeiture. You can keep most assets seized during drug operations regardless of the conviction, or it's a totally separate track. Research shows that the surge in arrests is tied to increased enforcement efforts due to the budget incentives more to increase drug activity. You look at the drug activity and you look at the arrests, they don't correlate. But the drug arrests correlate with the funding. Right? Again, it's not criticizing the police, they're responding naturally to the incentives. Prison population explosion. In the span of 25 years, the U.S. prison population went from 350,000 to over 2.3 million. The U.S. now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The U.S. imprisons a higher percentage of its black population than South Africa ever did during apartheid. Again, prison population is driven more by changes in sentencing policy than by violent crimes, when you look back at the trajectory over the years. So, drug felons, if you are a drug felon, you are barred from public housing, you are ineligible for food stamps, and you have to check the box on employment application. But when you check the box, that's going to take you out of the running for a lot of the jobs that you otherwise might be a good candidate for. 2/3 of prisoners in our country had incomes below $12,000 a year in the year prior to their arrest. 68% of released prisoners are rearrested within 3 years. The overwhelming majority of these rearrests are for non-violent crimes, often drug crimes, usually drug crimes and property crimes. Okay, now we might have the yeah, but going through our mind. The blacks use, sell drugs more than whites. I'm going to run through a bunch of statistics, and again, I'm just throwing stuff at you, just let it wash over you, do with it what you will, but these are the statistics. The blacks use or sell drugs more than whites. 2000 study by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, white students use cocaine at 7 times the rate, crack at 8 times the rate, and heroin at 7 times the rate of black students. National Household Survey on Drug Abuse, white youth 12 to 17 are 1/3 more likely to have sold illegal drugs than black youth 12 to 17. White youth 3 times more likely to have a drug-related ER visit than black youth. Whites tend to sell drugs to whites, blacks to blacks, urban to rural, rural to rural. So we sometimes have this image of sort of the black drug dealer, everybody coming to the inner city to get drugs from the black drug dealer. Studies show that you really sell to your own. The black drug scourge in the inner city is a black to black issue. It's obviously a problem, it's a huge problem, but it's not as much an interracial problem in that sense. So 1 in 14 black men were behind bars in 2006. Between the ages of 20 and 35, 1 in 9. Right, that's astounding. 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 35 were behind bars. 1 in 106 white men were behind bars in 2006. Okay? One book I do recommend that some of these statistics are coming from is a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. Implicit bias. Judges have less discretion than they used to because of the mandatory sentencing rules. Police and prosecutors have very broad discretion. So let me just give you some examples. We all have implicit bias, not just on race, I think, but just these are our own attitudes and experiences that can subconsciously shape how we interact with the world. It's not inherently bad because it's how we cope and navigate efficiently, but it can be bad when we don't acknowledge what's happening. Okay, I'll cite a couple studies. 60% of people who saw a crime news story that did not show the image of the criminal falsely recalled seeing one. 70% of those viewers said the criminal was black in the image that didn't exist. Okay? In video game with some suspects armed and some not, participants were more likely to mistake a black target as armed and a white target as unarmed. Georgia law permitted prosecutors to seek life imprisonment for a second drug offense. That was sought against 1% of white defendants and 16% of black defendants, and now 98% of prisoners serving life under this law are black. Okay? African American youth in the United States make up 16% of all youth, 28% of juvenile arrests, 35% of youth who are waived to adult court, meaning they're tried as adults, and 58% of youth admitted to adult state prison. These are just statistics. We can interpret them in different ways. What I'm pointing out is when there's lots of discretion, we're going to bring our own worldview and perspective to bear on how we exercise that discretion. Okay, just a few more studies. Blacks on the New Jersey Turnpike, 15% of all drivers, 42% of all police stops, 73% of all arrests. And among those stopped, whites were 2 times more likely than blacks to be carrying drugs. Volusia County, Florida, 5% of drivers were black or Latino, 80% of drivers stopped were black or Latino. And the disparity drops dramatically for nighttime stops. Daytime stops, it's massive disparity. You might say, well, why is that? Well, it's easier to see in the daytime, right? Okay, Oakland, California, blacks 2 times more likely to be stopped and 3 times more likely to be searched. This is what they call the circular illogic of racial profiling. We see the incredible, the overwhelming majority in most prisons of populations of color represented in the prison population. And we say, well, that's because they're committing a lot more crimes. So Philando Castile, you might have followed this in Minneapolis, the person who was shot by Officer Yanez. He was a licensed concealed carry holder, and he was, his girlfriend said he was going to get his wallet. The police officer thought he was going to get a gun, and he was shot like 7 times. And that's a whole case that we're not going to get into. But what I think it's important to note is Philando Castile, as an African-American living in Minneapolis, was pulled over 49 times in 13 years by police. He was not a serious criminal. I mean, yes, he was a marijuana user and he had some problems, but when you look at the records, a lot of them were for not wearing a seatbelt, not activating your turn signal when you pull into a parking lot. It was very minor things. In this room, I'm not sure there are many of us who have been pulled over 49 times by police in a lifetime, much less than 13 years. Okay, the Justice Declaration. This is on the radar screen of Christians. It actually is. So just in June, Prison Fellowship, which I think is one of the best Christian ministries. This is what Chuck Colson started, and still, after his passing, it's a remarkable organization. They're trying to bring attention to what they see as some of the injustices in our criminal justice system. So you can Google Justice Declaration and read about this. But they've organized a manifesto signed by evangelical leaders asserting our over-reliance on incarceration, which fails to make us safer or restore the people and communities who have been harmed. Prison Fellowship and this declaration calls for people, for Christ followers, to advocate for proportional punishment, to minister to the needs of families of prisoners, to celebrate redemption by welcoming those who have paid their debt to society, and provide opportunities for all to reach their God-given potential. So this is, I'm not saying that Christians aren't paying attention. I think there aren't enough Christians paying attention, right? I think our treatment of abortion is of tremendous moral import for Christians to engage in. I think our treatment of the criminal justice system and accused criminals is also an issue of tremendous moral import that needs more Christian engagement. So step back now as we're wrapping up just with some concluding remarks, and I have some time for questions. Building relationships across the divide. That is, how do we facilitate greater understanding, not just allocation of blame, responsibility, okay? An awareness of systems, not just attitudes, okay? I think we have made tremendous progress as a society in individuals' attitudes toward people of the other race. I am guessing, I hope, and I pray that there's not a person in here who would object to an African American coming to their home for dinner. That would not have been the case 50 years ago, right? That's progress. That's great. But we also can't ignore that our very troubled history in this era did not just stop when personal attitudes changed. that their history folds on itself, right? The legacy extends. We have to be aware of how systems work. Awareness of history's power to shape the present. The possibility of repentance, that sins can be social, not just individual. Of all people, Christians should believe the social dimension of sin. It's not just about the individual. Because creation is fallen, right? Societies are fallen. The willingness to face discomfort and experience another culture. We have to get out of our comfort zone, and that's going to look different depending on where we are, where we live, what we do for a job. And it's not just discomfort in terms of the black-white divide, but many of us here are in communities that have become much more diverse racially, ethnically, over the years, socioeconomically. It's about getting out of our comfort zone. Resisting the problem-solving mindset and embracing a relationship mindset. Let me give you one example. Our pastor in Minneapolis had this remarkable trip. There's an organization there called Sankofa, which is from a language in Ghana that means to reach back and claim something that might otherwise be lost. And what this organization did was got together a group of 15 white pastors and 15 black pastors, put them on a bus, and spent 4 or 5 days driving around the Deep South, visiting the key locations of the civil rights movement, right? Whether it's Selma, or whether the church bombing in Birmingham that killed the little girls going to Sunday school, or where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, all these different spots. And each white pastor was assigned to a black pastor, where they rode on the bus together, they shared a hotel room together, they were together the whole time. And what that did was, this is, I think, the ideal, if everybody in this room could have this experience, of where your experience of people's history through the eyes of the person. And they came back and said, it was amazing. But then our pastor said, when they got back, they had a sort of a debriefing meeting, and one of the white pastors said, okay, what are we going to do? What's our program? What are we going to institute now? And one of the black pastors said, we're not going to do any programs. How about we just get together once a month and have something to eat? Right? There is this tendency to, I'm in now, I'm engaged. We're going to solve the problem. And sometimes not that problem solving is bad, but you can't let that get ahead of an openness to relationship and listening and presence. Okay? And then listening. There's never enough listening. So, how do we do this in practical terms? Everybody will have different ideas. Different churches will have a different idea. It's going to look different based on your context. What I'm hoping is that the next time you see a news report of a Black Lives Matter protest or a shutdown of something, our initial response is not shaking our head, how could they? But is, I get it. I don't necessarily agree, but I get it. And then how do you come and be present to that brokenness and also be engaged on a systemic level of awareness of ways we can move forward with social change? Okay, a couple minutes if anybody has quick questions. Yes?
This isn't a question, this is a comment. Many times, when I see a black person that among whites,
Yep.
that are living on there, I put myself in the position that I were only white in a black room.
Right. Yep.
I'd be scared.
Yeah, no, and that's, so the observation is we're, especially in this area of the country and in evangelical circles in this area of the country, we may be used to seeing an African American person as the only African American person in a sea of white faces. And many times when a white person finds themselves as the only white person in a sea of black faces, there is a gravitation toward, well, something's wrong here, something's off. These are not my people. And how do we, and this wasn't your comment, but how do we switch where we can put ourselves more in those situations? And these are our people. They're all our people.
Can you comment on the characterization of the opioid problem in the country currently as it represented in this whole picture?
Yeah, the opioid crisis that's happening, so this might be what you're getting at, Tim, is there's some criticism of the renewed attention to the opioid crisis because now the drug problem has finally come to white America. So now we really have to take action, and we have more capacity to show empathy to addiction than we did when it was an inner city problem. Now in reality, it's always been more than an inner city problem. But there's that level of, yes, of course we should be proactive and strongly responsive in supporting people in this opioid addiction crisis, but we also need to be aware that there have been communities in our society that have been suffering and afflicted with this for a lot longer than the opioid crisis.
When an African American is killed by anyone who is not an African American, the victim seems to get support from the Black Lives Movement. When an African American is killed by another African American, the victim seems to get no support from Black Lives Matter. Could you shed some light on this inconsistency?
Good, great question. So the question is, when an African American is killed by a non-African American, there seems to be more support from the African American community than when an African American is killed by a fellow African American. Right? That's a perfectly fair question. So what my black friends, I believe, would say is there is and when it's a non-African American, it's usually because it's a member of law enforcement. That's where the big support has come. There is a systemic problem reflected in police-involved killings that brings different crises to the forefront than when it is the street violence within the black community. That's one issue, right? So there's some legal system injustice that's going on. Second, they would say, there is attention brought to the black on black communities, and there's lots of community organizations in the black community that are walking the streets at night, and there's rallies, and there's candlelight vigils and things. They don't get the widespread attention because they're not as shocking, and they don't get much media attention at all, and in fairness, they don't draw the same crowds. In Minneapolis, we had recently you might have read about the white woman from Australia who was shot by police, by a Somali American police officer who was responding to her 911 call. And she appears to be just a horrible case. And I think it's important to know that the leaders of Black Lives Matter were in that white neighborhood protesting and marching because they said these are some of the same issues that we've been struggling with. How are we training police officers? Why did he immediately shoot without taking any other steps? Which is not to say that everything has been done perfectly and totally consistently. It's just that the leaders in this community that I said is we are trying to bring attention to systemic issues of injustice, whether it's white or black. They happen to have fallen more along the black lines in these inner cities, which is why we're focused on that. But yes, the black on black violence is an absolutely critical problem as well. Maybe time for one more question, Kyle.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I think it's sad to note that historically, congregations and denominations that were more conservative theologically, and so would have held the line on the inerrancy of Scripture, the necessity of the atonement, Christ's actual physical death and resurrection, were also congregations that were way more likely to be much more conservative culturally. So we're, in essence, on the wrong side of the civil rights issue and civil rights debate, so that even the Southern Gospel music became the expression of, we don't want you in our church, but we want your music. And so we'll co-op and take it for ourselves, but we don't want you. And so I think it's really sad to note that historically conservative, theologically faithful denominations and congregations, nonetheless, and I think it just shows how fallen we are. We can be really right on one thing, but really on the wrong side of the coin on an issue like race relations.
Right. Great comment. And I want to be respectful of the time, so we'll end there. I'll stick around to answer questions. What's the topic tomorrow, Phil?
We're talking about atheists.
Tomorrow we're talking about atheists.
Before you go, I am not a college professor. I am not nearly as organized as my brother. I do not have handouts. So if you want to remember what I say, you need to bring your own paper and write stuff down like the Pilgrims did.
Okay, so I have to say one final word. I think in the church we need to talk about race more than less and find ways to connect and engage and be present. We're not going to solve all these problems, and the point is not to reach agreement. The point is to reach greater mutual understanding of walking alongside our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. So hopefully this made just a slight bit of forward progress in our understanding there. But thanks for coming, and Phil will take over tomorrow. See you tomorrow.